At 9:18 in the morning on October 11, 1943, Colonel Neil Kirby was sitting at 28,000 ft above the jungle coast of New Guinea, staring down at the largest formation of Japanese aircraft he had ever seen in his life. He wasn't supposed to be there alone. He wasn't supposed to be picking a fight with an air armada that stretched and across the sky like a dark river. He had 4 planes, and somewhere below him, stacked in layers between 15,000 and 20,000 ft, was a wall of Japanese fighters and bombers that numbered somewhere above 60 aircraft. Any sane commander in the United States Army Air Forces would have turned around, radioed the base, and called for reinforcements. Kirby pushed the throttle forward and started climbing higher. To understand why a decorated colonel with a chest full of ribbons would fly 4 planes into 60, you have to go back to the beginning of the argument, not the argument over Wewak, the argument over the airplane. The argument that had been following Neil Kirby since the moment he arrived in the Pacific Theater with his P-47 Thunderbolts, and every senior officer in the region looked at his machines and quietly shook their heads. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not built for this part of the world. That was the official position, and on paper, it made perfect sense. The Jug, that was the nickname because the fuselage was round and thick and shaped roughly like a milk jug, weighed 7 tons when fully loaded. It had an 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower and made a noise that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. It was the biggest, heaviest single-engine fighter America had put into the war. In Europe, it was at home high-altitude escort missions, diving on German ground targets, absorbing punishment that would have torn a smaller plane to pieces. It was built to be hit and keep flying. But the Pacific was not Europe. The Pacific had the Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was everything the Jug was not. It weighed less than half as much. It could turn so tightly that American pilots described fighting one as trying to swat a hummingbird with a baseball bat. It could climb fast, maneuver hard, and it could stay in a turning fight almost indefinitely because it carried almost no armor and used every ounce of saved weight to feed its agility. The Zero had torn through American, British, and Dutch air forces in the early years of the war like a knife through paper. The first rule every Pacific pilot learned, the rule that was practically carved into the walls of every briefing room from Hawaii to Australia, was simple and absolute. Never turn with a Zero. If you try to outmaneuver it, you will lose. Every time without exception. The problem was that the P-47 couldn't follow that rule and survive. According to the men who were supposed to know best, you couldn't turn with a Zero, and the Jug certainly couldn't outturn one. So, what exactly was a Jug supposed to do in a Pacific dogfight? The experts in theater command had a ready answer. Not much. The P-38s were better suited for long-range Pacific work. The Grumman Wildcats and Hellcats had been built specifically to counter Japanese fighters. The Thunderbolt was a European machine dropped into the wrong war. Senior officers looked at Kirby's squadron and saw a liability they were stuck with. The mockery wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quieter than that. A dismissive look in a briefing, an assignment that kept the Thunderbolts away from the serious work. A comment passed between staff officers about how the 47th Group was going to get itself chewed up the moment it met real Zero opposition. Other pilots flying their lighter machines would glance over at the fat, round-nosed Thunderbolts and make the kind of jokes that don't need to be repeated to land. The Jug was a bus. The Jug was a flying safe. The Jug belonged in a different ocean entirely. Neil Kirby heard every word of it, and he spent his nights working on the answer. Not because he was reckless or needed to prove something for its own sake, but because he understood something about his airplane that the critics were too busy dismissing to notice. The P-47 couldn't turn with a Zero. That was true, and he never argued against it. But the Zero had its own weakness, and that weakness was altitude. The Zero had no turbo supercharger. At high altitude above 20,000 ft, the thin air starved its engine and killed its performance. The Zero that was untouchable and terrifying at 15,000 ft became a slow, struggling machine at 25,000. The P-47, with its massive turbo supercharger feeding compressed air into that 18-cylinder engine, actually got better the higher it climbed. At altitude, the Jug could outrun almost anything Japan put in the sky. What Kirby built from that single fact was a doctrine, and he drilled it into his pilots with the obsessive patience of a man who understood that the details were the difference between coming home and not coming home. You climbed high, higher than felt comfortable, higher than felt necessary. You stayed above 20,000 FT. You picked your target from above. You rolled into a dive. You built your speed on the way down until you were coming in at over 400 mph. And you fired at close range and blew through the formation before the Japanese pilots could react. Then you climbed back up, back to altitude, back to the position where the Jug was a predator and not prey. You never circled. You never slowed down to fight a turning battle. You dove, you killed, and you climbed. One pass, one kill, and get back up before the Zeros could organize a response. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the classic swirling dogfight that looked good in a newsreel. It was efficient, cold, and brutally effective. If you had the discipline to stick to it, no matter what your instincts were telling you in the middle of a fight, command remained skeptical. 4 kills over a minor Japanese patrol over New Guinea and Kirby's early missions looked good on paper, but it didn't settle the debate. Anyone could get lucky against a small force. The Pacific War was going to be decided by what happened when American pilots ran into a real concentration of Japanese air power, a major base, a full escort wing, a formation with enough aircraft to swarm you from every direction. That test hadn't come yet for the Thunderbolts. The critics were still waiting to be right. And then on October 11, 1943, with 4 aircraft and a tactic that senior command had never fully blessed, Neil Kirby flew to Wewak and found his test waiting for him at 20,000 FT. The Japanese formation below him was not a patrol. It was not a minor convoy escort. It was the main event. Bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft stacked in layers, heading out on their own missions, unaware that 4 American planes were sitting high above them in the thin air where the Zero's engine gasped and the Thunderbolt's engine sang. The skeptics were sitting in their briefing rooms 500 m away. Kirby was here with his 7-ton machine humming at full power, looking down at 60 Japanese aircraft and deciding which one to kill first. Before a single gun was fired over Wewak, Neil Kirby had already fought the most important battle of his career, and he had fought it on the ground in briefing tents, over maps and diagrams against men who outranked him and were absolutely certain he was wrong. That battle had started months earlier, back when his Thunderbolts first arrived in the Pacific, and the reaction from theater command ranged from polite indifference to barely concealed contempt. Kirby understood that contempt. He didn't resent it. He just used it as fuel because he knew something that the skeptics didn't. That the P-47's greatest strength was something nobody had properly tested yet. And until he tested it himself in combat against real Zeros at real altitude, he was just another pilot with an opinion. So he started with the machine. Before he built any doctrine, before he drew a single diagram or briefed a single pilot, Kirby spent weeks learning his aircraft at a level that went well beyond what the flight manual required. He wasn't interested in what the Thunderbolt was designed to do in general. He was interested in what his specific aircraft could do at the specific altitudes and in the specific conditions of the Southwest Pacific. He worked with his mechanics the way a boxer works with a trainer, pushing the equipment to find its exact limits, finding the sweet spots, identifying the margins where the machine performed beyond expectations and the margins where it fell apart. His crew tuned the engine for peak output at high altitude, adjusting the turbo supercharger settings to squeeze every possible pound of thrust out of the Pratt & Whitney at 25,000 FT and above. Most pilots flew their aircraft as they were delivered. Kirby flew his like. It was a custom tool he had built himself. What he discovered in those early weeks of testing confirmed everything he had argued in the briefing rooms. At low altitude, the Thunderbolt was a fat, sluggish machine that a Zero could run circles around. But above 20,000 FT, the equation flipped completely. The Zero's engine, which had no turbocharging system to compensate for the thin air, lost power and responsiveness as altitude increased. Its climb rate dropped. Its top speed dropped. The razor-sharp maneuverability that made it so deadly at 15,000 FT became blunt and ordinary at 25,000. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, was in its element. The turbo supercharger pumped compressed air into the engine regardless of altitude, keeping the power output strong and consistent, where the Zero was already struggling to breathe. And when you pushed the Thunderbolt into a dive from that altitude, when you pointed that 7-ton machine straight down and let gravity do the work, the physics became grotesque. A heavy object falling from a great height doesn't just go fast. It goes faster than anything that started from a lower point could possibly catch. The Thunderbolt, in a full power dive from 28,000 FT, could reach speeds that left pursuing Zeros so far behind they might as well have been standing still. Kirby built his entire doctrine on that single brutal fact. He called it altitude discipline, and he was religious about it in a way that made some of his pilots uncomfortable at first. The rules were non-negotiable. You climbed before you engaged always. You did not drop down to the enemy's level to begin an attack. You did not start a fight below 20,000 FT if you could possibly avoid it. You identified your target from above. You rolled into your dive from a position of height advantage, and you built your attack speed on the way down, so that by the time you reached firing range, you were moving so fast that the Japanese pilot you were targeting had at best 2 or 3 seconds to react before the 850 caliber machine guns in your wings ended the conversation permanently. Then you pulled out of the dive, pointed the nose back up, and climbed. You climbed even when your instincts were screaming at you to turn around and finish the fight. You climbed even when you thought you could get one more shot. You climbed because the moment you slowed down and started circling, you were no longer in a Thunderbolt fight. You were in a Zero fight. And in a Zero fight, the Zero always won. He drilled it into his men through repetition that bordered on monotony. They flew mock engagements above the jungle with Kirby playing the role of the attacker and his wingmen practicing the discipline of not breaking formation to chase, not diving after a target they had already passed, not letting the excitement of a kill pull them down to a lower altitude where everything went wrong. Pilots who grew up flying lighter, more maneuverable aircraft had to unlearn a whole set of instincts. In a Spitfire or a P-40, your agility was your safety net. If you got into trouble, you turned harder and tightened the circle and worked your way out. In the Thunderbolt, turning harder was how you died. Your safety net was altitude and speed. And the moment you spent either one carelessly, you were exposed in the worst possible way. Slow, low, and surrounded by aircraft that were built for exactly that situation. The first real test came over Wewak in the weeks before October 11th, when Kirby led his flight against a Japanese patrol and brought down 4 enemy aircraft without losing a single Thunderbolt. The tactic worked exactly as designed. The Japanese pilots never had time to organize a response because the attack was over before they understood what was happening. 4 aircraft appeared from high altitude at enormous speed, passed through the formation like a freight train through a cardboard wall, and climbed back up before the surviving Zero pilots could even reverse their turns to pursue. 4 kills, no losses. By any measure, it was a success. By the measure of theater command, it was a promising result that needed more data before it changed anyone's thinking about the Thunderbolt's role in the Pacific. Kirby needed more data. He knew exactly where to get it. Allied reconnaissance had been building a picture of Wewak for months, and what that picture showed was deeply uncomfortable. Wewak was not a forward outpost or a secondary Japanese airfield. It was the main hub of Japanese air power in the entire New Guinea campaign, a sprawling complex of airstrips on the northern coast where Japan was staging aircraft for operations across the Southwest Pacific. The reconnaissance photos showed between 100 and 150 aircraft operating out of Wewak at any given time. Fighters, bombers, transport planes, and reconnaissance aircraft moved in and out of the base in a continuous stream. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force under MacArthur, understood that Wewak had to be broken if the Allied campaign in New Guinea was going to move forward. You couldn't push an army up the coast of New Guinea while 150 Japanese aircraft sat on a base behind you, free to attack your supply lines and your airfields whenever the mood struck. Kirby volunteered to lead a reconnaissance in force, a small, fast flight that would go in, assess the Japanese activity, engage targets of opportunity, and get out before the base's defenses could organize a proper response. The number of aircraft he proposed for this mission raised eyebrows at the command level. He was asking to take 4 Thunderbolts to the most heavily defended Japanese airbase in the Southwest Pacific, 4 planes. The response from staff officers carried a familiar flavor, the same polite skepticism, the same careful language that meant roughly the same thing the Crutter comments had meant months before. 4 planes against Wewak was not a reconnaissance in force. It was a funeral procession. Kirby went anyway. On the morning of October 11, 1943, he led his 3 wingmen north toward the coast, climbing the whole way, pressing the Thunderbolts up through 20,000 FT and passed it up to 28,000 where the air was thin and cold, and the turbo superchargers were working at the peak of their design. When Wewak appeared below him and the scale of the Japanese formation became clear, there was no moment of hesitation, no reassessment, no radio call back to base for guidance. Hereby looked down at the mass of Japanese aircraft filling the sky below him and felt the thing that his doctrine had been building toward all along. The absolute unshakable confidence of a man who knows exactly what his machine can do, who has rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head, and who understands with complete clarity that the only direction that matters right now is straight down. He rolled the Thunderbolt over and pointed the nose at the first target. The moment Kirby rolled the Thunderbolt inverted and pulled the nose down toward the Japanese formation, the laws of physics took over in a way that no amount of expert opinion could argue with. A 7-ton machine with a 2,000 horsepower engine pointed straight down from 28,000 FT doesn't fall so much as it commits. It locks onto the ground with a kind of terrible purpose, building speed the way an avalanche builds mass, unstoppable and indifferent to everything in its path. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 mph before Kirby had even identified his first target clearly. By the time he was close enough to fire, he was moving at well over 400 mph, which meant that the Japanese pilot he was diving on had roughly the same amount of time to react as a man who looks up and sees a safe falling from a 4th-floor window directly above his head. The first target was a Mitsubishi P-47 reconnaissance aircraft, a long-nosed twin-engine Japanese plane that the Allied pilots had nicknamed the Dina. It was fast for its type, built for speed and range rather than combat, and it was flying at the upper edge of its comfortable altitude range, which meant its crew was already working harder than they wanted to keep it level and moving. They never saw Kirby coming. The Dino was cruising in a straight line, doing exactly what reconnaissance aircraft are supposed to do. And from the cockpit of that plane, the sky above was clear and empty because nobody expected an attack from 28,000 FT over their own base. Hereby closed the distance in seconds, fired his 850 caliber machine guns at a range so short that missing was genuinely more difficult than hitting. And the Dinana came apart the way a balsa wood model comes apart when you throw it against a brick wall instantly, completely with pieces going in every direction at once. He was already pulling up and climbing before the wreckage had time to begin its fall toward the jungle below. That was kill number 1. And it had taken less time from the start of the dive to the moment of destruction than it takes to read a paragraph. That was the entire point. The Japanese formation around him was enormous. Aircraft stacked at multiple altitudes, fighters and bombers moving in different directions. The whole mass of it spread across several thousand FT of vertical airspace. And in the first few seconds after Kirby's pass, the reaction from the Japanese pilots was exactly what his doctrine had predicted. Confusion, not panic yet, just the genuine cognitive delay of trained men trying to process an attack that came from an unexpected direction at an unexpected speed. That delay was the window, and Kirby was already using it. He climbed back to altitude with the Thunderbolt's engine pulling hard, the turbo supercharger keeping the power up in the thin air, and he picked the second target before he had finished the climb. A Zero fighter had spotted the attack and was attempting to gain altitude to respond, clawing its way upward toward 20,000 FT with everything its engine had. At low altitude, that Zero would have been climbing at a rate that made most American fighters look lazy. Up here above 22,000 FT, the Zero's engine was soft and the climb was labored, and the altitude it was reaching for was still below where Kirby already was. He didn't wait for it to get closer. He rolled again, built his speed in the dive, and hit the Zero while it was still in the climb, still slow, still committed to a direction it couldn't change fast enough. And the 850 calibers at close range turned the lightest, most maneuverable fighter in the Pacific into a fireball that fell away from the sky like a dropped torch. Kill number 2. The pattern was becoming visible to anyone watching from above, but watching from above was exactly where nobody else was. Kirby's 3 wingmen were working their own targets at slightly lower altitudes, applying the same doctrine, diving and climbing, refusing to be drawn into turning fights, maintaining the altitude advantage that the whole mission depended on. The Japanese formation was large enough that individual pilots within it were only now beginning to understand that they were under attack. That this was not a single stray aircraft that had wandered into their airspace, but a coordinated assault from a small group of Americans who had been sitting above them long enough to pick their shots carefully. Kirby's third pass targeted a Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the long-range naval bomber that Allied crews had named the Betty, a large twin-engine aircraft with an enormous fuel load that Allied pilots had discovered early in the war, had a tendency to catch fire with a violence that seemed almost personal. The Betty carried so much aviation fuel stored in tanks that ran the full length of its wings, without the self-sealing protection that American bombers used, that a burst of 50 caliber rounds into the wing root didn't just damage the aircraft. It turned the entire fuel system into a running fire that the crew had no way to fight and no time to escape. Hereby came down on the Betty from above and behind where the tail gunner's field of fire was narrowest and the wing roots were most exposed. And he held the trigger down through the firing pass with the kind of deliberate patience that only becomes possible when you're moving so fast that the target is filling your gun's sight faster than fear can catch up with your hands. The Betty's left wing lit from root to tip, and the aircraft rolled over and went down, trailing a column of black smoke thick enough to mark the spot from 20 m away. Kill number 3. By this point, the Japanese formation had transformed from an organized flight into something closer to a disturbed anthill, aircraft turning in multiple directions, pilots trying to locate the source of attacks that kept coming from above. Zero fighters breaking off from their escort positions to climb toward an altitude they couldn't quite reach before the next pass was already over. Kirby watched the movement below him with the specific clarity of a man whose preparation has put him in exactly the situation he prepared for. And he saw what he needed. One of his wingmen lower than he should have been with a Zero lining up behind him at a range that was closing fast. Hereby didn't calculate the intercept. He rolled and dove on pure instinct sharpened by months of training, dropping between the Zero and his wingman with enough speed that the Japanese pilot had exactly 2 choices: break off the attack or be destroyed. And the choice was made for him before he could fully process that it existed. The Zero disintegrated under the 50 calibers at a range so close that Kirby flew through the debris field of the aircraft he had just killed, feeling the pieces of it rattle against the Thunderbolt's thick aluminum skin. Kill number 4, and the wingman climbed away unaware of how close the margin had been. 3 of his pilots were signaling now, ammunition running low, fuel state demanding attention, the silent arithmetic of combat logistics that no amount of adrenaline could override forever. The rational call was to climb, form up, and go home with 4 kills and every pilot alive, which by any standard was a mission worth celebrating. Kirby acknowledged the signals and began the climb. And then he saw the 5th target, and then the 6th, and the doctrine he had built with such iron discipline bent slightly under the weight of what he saw, not out of recklessness, but out of the recognition that the window was still open, the altitude was still his, and the Thunderbolt still had ammunition enough for 2 more passes. The 5th kill was another Zero, caught at the wrong altitude at the wrong moment, destroyed with an efficiency that had become almost mechanical by this point in the engagement. The 6th was harder. Kirby was lower now, deeper into the altitude band where the Zeros were more capable with less energy stored in his aircraft and less margin for error on the pull-out. He fired through the pass with the kind of commitment that burns the option of changing your mind. The 50 calibers tearing through the target aircraft at a range that the Thunderbolt's designers had probably never specifically envisioned. And he pulled out of the dive with the canyon walls of altitude closing around him, climbing nearly vertical on full emergency power, with the engine pushed past every setting that the manual called comfortable. The Zeros that tried to follow him upward lasted about 30 seconds before the altitude ate their engines alive, and they fell away below. Unable to climb where Kirby was already flying, he leveled off above 25,000 FT, pointed the Thunderbolt south toward home, and began the long flight back with 6 kills confirmed, minimal fuel, a handful of fresh holes in the airframe, and a set of gun cameras that had recorded every second of what had just happened over Wewak. Kirby landed at WWII with 6 confirmed kills, a Thunderbolt that had taken enough hits to make the ground crew's faces go pale when they walked around it, and a fuel state so low that a longer return flight would have ended the mission in the jungle rather than on a runway. The mechanics who swarmed the aircraft when it rolled to a stop weren't celebrating yet. They were counting holes, tracing hydraulic lines, checking the engine for stress fractures that a hard combat mission at full emergency power could leave behind in metal. The same way a long sprint leaves damage in a human knee. The Thunderbolt had taken the punishment and brought its pilot home, which was exactly what it was designed to do. And the ground crew ran their hands over the battered airframe with the quiet appreciation of people who understood what that kind of durability actually cost to build and maintain. The debrief that followed was the moment when the number became real for the people who hadn't been in the sky to see it. When Kirby walked into the intelligence tent and began working through the engagement with the debriefing officers, altitude of contact, number of aircraft in the Japanese formation, sequence of attacks, observed results, the reaction in the room shifted in a specific way that anyone who has ever delivered genuinely surprising news will recognize. The officers were writing fast, asking him to slow down and repeat details, cross-referencing his account against the wingmen's reports, doing the arithmetic of a mission that kept producing a number that seemed too large to accept without verification. 6 confirmed kills in a single engagement with 4 aircraft over one of the most heavily defended Japanese air bases in the Southwest Pacific, without losing a single Thunderbolt or pilot. The intelligence officers sent for the gun camera film before the debrief was even finished, because the gun camera film was the only thing that was going to settle the question of whether the number was real. The film settled it completely. Frame by frame, the footage showed exactly what Kirby's doctrine looked like when it was executed perfectly against a large, well-equipped enemy force. The divvies from altitude, the firing passes at close range, the climbs back up before the Japanese could organize a response, and 6 separate aircraft destroyed in a sequence so methodical that it looked less like a dog fight and more like a demonstration. The skeptics who had spent months explaining why the Thunderbolt was the wrong machine for the Pacific theater watched that film and found themselves without the vocabulary to maintain their position, because the position had been destroyed as thoroughly as the 6 Japanese aircraft on the screen in front of them. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, understood immediately what the footage meant, not just for Kirby, but for the entire Pacific Air Campaign, and for every P-47 pilot who had been flying in the shadow of the assumption that his aircraft was a liability. Kenny forwarded the recommendation for the Medal of Honor through channels with a speed that reflected how clearly he grasped the significance of what had happened over Wewak. General Douglas MacArthur personally awarded Kirby by the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States could give, specifically citing the action of October 11, 1943, the mission that Theater Command had looked at sideways when Kirby proposed it and couldn't look away from once he completed it. The award changed the conversation about the Thunderbolt in the Pacific in a way that months of tactical arguments had failed to do, because a Medal of Honor attached to a specific set of gun camera footage is a more persuasive document than any briefing paper ever written. The 5th Air Force began integrating the altitude discipline doctrine that Kirby had built from the ground up into its formal training and tactical guidance. The heavy round-nosed machine that had been called a flying bus and a liability and a European problem dropped into the wrong ocean was suddenly the aircraft that had produced the most dramatic single-mission kill count of the Pacific Air War to that point, and the pilots who flew it began to carry themselves differently because of it. Kirby kept flying. That was the part of his story that carries a particular weight, because it is the part where the vindication he had earned began to work against him in a way he probably recognized, but couldn't stop. He had 22 confirmed aerial kills by early 1944, which made him one of the leading American aces in any theater of the entire war. He knew that Eddie Rickenbacker's record from the First World War stood at 26 kills. And the people around Kirby knew that he knew it, and the knowledge sat in the room during every mission briefing like an additional piece of equipment that hadn't been officially issued, but was present regardless. The drive that had made him ignore the skeptics and build a doctrine from nothing and fly 4 planes into 60 was the same drive that was now pushing him toward a record. And drive that has no governor on it eventually puts a man in a situation his skill can't fully compensate for. On March 5, 1944, Kirby flew into an engagement over Wewak, the same sky where he had proven everything he needed to prove, and the engagement went wrong in the specific ways that his doctrine had been designed to prevent. He was at a disadvantageous altitude. The numbers were against him in a way that his method couldn't fully address, and the margin that altitude and speed had always provided him was gone. He was shot down over the jungle of New Guinea. He was 32 years old, and the war had another year and a half left to run without him. What he left behind was not a footnote. The tactical framework he built from his understanding of the Thunderbolt strengths became foundational doctrine for the 5th Air Force through the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. The P-47 went on to fly more than 700,000 combat sorties across every theater of the war. And a significant portion of the pilots who flew it in the Pacific flew it the way Kirby had demonstrated it should be flown, from altitude at speed with the discipline to climb back up and resist the pull of a turning fight that the Zero would always win. The men who came after him fought differently because of what he showed them, and the ones who survived to come home carried the shape of his thinking in the way they approached every engagement for the rest of their flying lives. The P-47 Thunderbolt hangs in museums today as a monument to brute force: 7 tons of aluminum and steel, 8 machine guns, 2,000 horsepower, the biggest and heaviest single-engine fighter America built in the entire war. Visitors walk around it and see a machine built to absorb punishment and deal it out in equal measure, a product of industrial America at the absolute peak of its wartime manufacturing power. What they don't see is the argument that preceded it. The months of dismissal and mockery and official skepticism that a single colonel from Texas absorbed and then answered with gun camera footage and a Medal of Honor citation. They don't see the doctrine built in a briefing tent, the altitude and discipline drilled into pilots who had to unlearn everything their instincts told them, the 4 planes that flew north towards 60 and came home with 6 kills and no losses. We rescue these stories to ensure Neil Kirby doesn't disappear into silence, because the men who changed how wars were fought rarely did it with the permission of the people who were supposed to know better. And the ones who ignored the mockery long enough to be proven right deserve to be remembered by. Thanks for watching.